Yeah, I'll give you a little backdrop, the history. Basically, medicine, surgical techniques have been changing a lot in the last couple of decades from things that are typically pretty invasive and surgical to moving to things that are very minimally invasive or non-surgical. And as such, it's been moving sort of from hospitals and ambulatory surgery centers to office-based procedures that are minimally invasive. When you move patients into the office setting, you have to provide some form of sedation, make sure the patients are comfortable. And as we started to make that move in my field and in other fields, we ran up against an obstacle, and that is, how do you provide an optimal level of sedation where the patient's extremely comfortable and at the same time make sure that their airway's protected and that their oxygen saturations, et cetera, are good. So when it took off in my field, I recognized that it was difficult because the level of sedation that I could provide for them that would make sure that they maintain their airway and things were nice and safe was such that with a good number of them, they might be uncomfortable or they might even have recollection of the procedure. What I needed was an airway, something that I could use specifically for IV sedation cases. And it was interesting. I went to my administrator and I said, look, this is the exact same thing I'm looking for. This would be the way it would be made and it has to exist. And when we did the research, we realized it just didn't exist at all. In fact, the production of an airway specifically for IV sedation cases had never been made before. There had been a lot of research about things for general anesthesia, like the breathing tubes that are put in, or this fancy form of a breathing tube called a laryngeal mask airway. And for the most part, otherwise, there was just these little oral airways that are put in people's throats that are not designed specifically for IV sedation. They were really designed just to be put in following general anesthetic cases while the patient was being transferred to recovery room. So since it didn't exist, we started to design it. And the design really had multiple pieces. It needed to be able to be comfortably fitting in the person's airway, and while it was in there, supporting it. At the same time, it needed to provide excellent oxygen to the lungs, the same way a breathing tube would, but without contact with the vocal cords or the breathing apparatus so it doesn't overstimulate them, since the patient's not under general anesthesia. It also needed to be able to measure something called capnography, and basically that's an accurate measurement of the CO2 being exhaled from the lungs. For the surgeon that's working, for the anesthesiologist that's using it, that demonstrates to them that the breathing that the patient's doing is effective, which means they're going to be moving oxygen in and blowing CO2 out in an effective way. So we developed that airway, and the airway basically was a modification of a traditional oral airway where it was divided into two channels that were closed. The oral airways that existed had no such division and were open, and they had no mechanism to hold an oxygen cannula. This has a seat where the oxygen cannula will fit tight, and therefore as the oxygen comes from the oxygen tank and gets delivered to the airway, it has a tight seal, and it's closed all the way to the point where the airway's open, which literally rests just a few millimeters from the vocal cord level. That will jet ventilate very high oxygen concentration directly at the vocal cord level. And also, since it's right at the vocal cord level as the patient begins to exhale, it really measures that early capnography so we can measure the effective ventilation. It was a concept. We drew it up, we 3D printed it, and after we messed with that 3D print to just kind of optimize the device, we began to manufacture it and get it FDA approved and get a patent on the airway, and probably have somewhere in the neighborhood of, 3,000-4,000 cases done with it now. 3 different sizes for different size airways, for different size individuals. And it's really proven to be extremely effective because it's actually designed for this purpose, for IV sedation.